Hey guys, it's me again, Brittany Lee the Bio Geek, here with another anatomy video for your learning and educational pleasure. So my first two videos of the skeletal system, I talked about the skull and all the landmarks within the skull. And my second video focused exclusively on vertebrae, where I talked about what the different types of vertebrae are, what landmarks are between them, and how you can tell disarticulated vertebrae when they're just by themselves on a table. So this video is going to carry on with the axial skeleton, and I'm going to specifically focus today on the sternum and the rib cage, as well as the hyoid bone up here. So the sternum and the rib cage collectively make up the thoracic cage, which is a series of bones that encapsulate the thoracic cavity. Now, you might know that there's a lot of really important structures in the thoracic cavity. We're talking about the lungs, the heart, and most of the major blood vessels, arteries and veins that supply blood and drain blood from most areas of the body. So having this protective flat bone structure surrounding this area is going to be super important. So let's talk about what each of these bones are and what their landmarks are and how you can tell them apart on exams. So we'll begin with the sternum, which sits in the midline at the upper region of the thoracic cage. It's broken up into three parts. The most superior or top aspect of the sternum is called the manubrium. The larger flat part in the middle is called the body. And at the inferior end here, this little triangular shape is going to be your xiphoid process. So manubrium, body, and xiphoid process, all of the sternum. So let's move on and talk about the ribs. Your ribs can be broken up into two major categories. Now, you have 12 ribs total. So your first 7 are going to be true ribs, and your last 5 ribs are going to be false ribs. So your true ribs are also called vertebrosternal ribs, and they're named because of their posterior and anterior attachments. So posteriorly, your ribs are going to articulate with the vertebral column. That gives the word vertebro. The anterior portion of these ribs is going to articulate directly with the sternal cartilages. So sternal, vertebro, sternal ribs. So those are going to be your first 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The last 5 are going to be called false ribs. Now, they're false ribs because they don't directly articulate anteriorly to the sternum as the first 7 do. Now, within your false ribs, you have 2 different categories of ribs. They're called vertebrochondral ribs or vertebral ribs. So ribs 8, 9, and 10 are called vertebrochondral ribs, named for their anterior and posterior articulations. So posteriorly, your ribs, as you saw with the first 7, are going to articulate with the vertebral column, giving the part vertebro. Anteriorly, these ribs are going to articulate with cartilage that attaches to the sternal cartilage. So they don't articulate directly to the sternal cartilages. They articulate indirectly with the sternal cartilages, which makes them false ribs. So 8, 9, and 10, these are all going to be our vertebrochondral ribs. Now, ribs 11 and 12 are called vertebral ribs, or floating ribs. These 2 ribs are only going to articulate posteriorly with the vertebrae and not have any anterior attachments. They're just floating at the anterior portion of those ribs. So we said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are going to be your true vertebrosternal ribs. 8, 9, and 10 are going to be your false vertebrochondral ribs. And 11 and 12 are going to be your vertebral false ribs. The last bone I want to talk about in the axial skeleton is going to be the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a tiny bone that sits in the upper region of the throat. Now, this bone does not articulate with other bones. It's nestled in the middle of cartilages and ligaments that make up regions of the throat. So the hyoid is going to be super important in speaking and swallowing. So if you put your hands on your throat and swallow, you can actually feel your hyoid bone moving within your throat. Now, on the hyoid bone, you have these greater horns at the back and these lesser horns at the front, both located on the superior surface of the hyoid bone. And those are going to be important attachment points for a lot of those muscles that aid in swallowing and speaking. So let's run that back and see if we remember what some of these things are. This bone generally was called the sternum, very good. In the middle was the body, perfect. Triangular piece of the tip here, xiphoid process, excellent. This free-floating bone up here in the throat, the hyoid, perfect. Our last two ribs at the bottom, we called those perfect, floating ribs or vertebral ribs. Our first 7 we called the vertebrosternal, perfect. And then in the middle here we had our 3 vertebrochondral ribs, awesome. Well, that concludes my axial skeleton videos. I hope you found this really informative. This is a pretty light section of the skeletal system. It doesn't consist of a lot of landmarks or things you need to remember. So hopefully this helped you in studying and in learning the parts of the bones. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye.